Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you for your defense of political communication and the role of advising political campaigns at a time when politics seems to matter more and more, which is also, I think, could you hear me? Okay. Which is also, I believe, the context for this whole conference, New Communication, New Politics. I want to thank you for inviting me to this is the third time that I have participated in the conferences in Bilbao. I participate because I'm drawn to Bilbao, I'm drawn to Basque Country, I'm drawn institutions, I'm drawn to Spain, I'm drawn to the Latin American participation in this program. I'm drawn to the mix of academics and practitioners that come here, perhaps uniquely, and hopefully to contribute and to learn. I'm pleased to be able to give the keynote address. I do not write out speeches, and so that I don't fit into the mold of providing a text in advance with apologies to the translators, so I will try to speak slowly as I develop my thinking in front of you. I'm also not using a PowerPoint, which is what one usually does when presenting virtually every presentation that I do. But I decided in a keynote that it was much better to reflect on what's happening, concentrate on the ideas that I'm advancing, rather than data and rather than the methodology. So we come together at a time of great turmoil and uncertainty. That includes Brexit. It includes the decline of the mainstream parties in virtually every country in Europe and also in some ways across Latin America. It comes at a time when nationalist, racist, and anti-system parties are gaining a greater presence across Europe, also left anti-elitist parties as well. It comes at a time when the collapse of the Chavista, Cuban Peronist axis, so that you have great uncertainty in Brazil and Venezuela, maybe Argentina, and also at a time of uncertainty about polling, which is also seen not only to be getting the outcomes wrong, but also impacting what actually happens in the elections because of in some cases, misperceptions where the country stands. And it's also a time of Donald Trump and what that means and what happens if the United States really becomes part of that. And I want to, and that's particularly true with Brexit, where people believe the elites in Europe look at what happened on Brexit believing that it couldn't happen, and now are very cautious in looking at Donald Trump and saying, are we sure it can't happen in the United States? So we have that backdrop of uncertainty around global politics and what happens in all parts of the world. Now, let me begin with Donald Trump. So I want to spend my time talking about political communication, but I want to start with Donald Trump, not so much with Donald Trump. I want to start with America, because I wrote a book called America Ascendant, which is a title that is at odds with the perceptions of American decline or an America being racked by polarization and the emergence of racist nationalist forces represented by Trump. But I want to begin with my book. When I spoke here, I was pre-staging a book that I had written with James Carville on It's the Middle Class Stupid. But as I did my presentation here, and I was focused then on what was happening in the United States, the decline of the middle class, the drop in wages, the growing inequality, and I had this very strong critique of kind of the economic structures that were evolving in America, and the kind of the inability of Obama and national leaders to understand the kind of structural economic changes taking place in the country. And I stopped in my presentation, which was really a chapter of the book. I stopped in the middle of the presentation because I gave this speech at a time right after the financial crisis, when the bust of the bubble, housing bubble in Spain. Unemployment at all class levels and age levels in Spain. And I just stopped the speech. Now, by the way, in my current book, afterward, I write about the speech that I gave here, saying what led me to write a book. Since when I did It's the Middle Class Stupid, I was very focused on the decline, the polarization, decline of the middle class, wage decline, inequality. And when I would talk about America, whether it was here or whether the people I was working with in Venezuela, what I began to realize is that it's not okay for America to be in decline. It's not okay for modernizers in Europe, modernizers in Latin America. It's not okay for America to not have a strategy for having a shared prosperity, for not being a country that's welcoming new waves of immigration, unlike other countries that are continuing struggling against racial and ethnic diversity. Surely America must have a model for dealing with these changes in ways that other countries have not. And I ultimately concluded in writing America Ascendant, I changed the title. It wasn't called America Ascendant when I wrote it, and not when I gave my presentation here in Bilbao. But it was out of those conversations that I said, if you look deeper, why are these changes happening? If we're looking at there's huge revolutionary changes taking place in America that have to do with technology, have to do with urbanization. People don't see the vast change in trends in urbanization, which have produced an America where America is the most urbanized of all the developed countries. And so you have a huge in-migration to the cities and to the densest part of cities. And so as McKinsey looks at why the U.S. is growing at a greater rate than Europe, the biggest reason for it is urbanization and density. And millennials, who are now exceeding the baby boomers, have moved into the cities, the largest cities, in large numbers. Millennial college graduates, over 3/4 of them already have moved to the 50 largest cities. And so 40% of the millennials are secular. You have a minority population that 40% of the millennials are minority. 15% of new marriages are interracial. There is a conspiracy of elites to foster immigration in a way that is understated by the issue of legalization of the undocumented, which is Trump's issue. 37% of New York City is foreign-born. Over 80% of Chinese postgraduates stay. So American business, American elites, immigration laws are not enforced in American cities. They've stopped enforcing the laws on immigration. The elites are in a vast conspiracy to ensure the growing diversity of America, both racial, ethnic, immigrant, foreign. And America's cities are being transformed. The millennials are being transformed as a generation. And America is culturally and economically dynamic in ways that other countries aren't. Huge problems, which I'll talk about, which is why I think America is about to enter a new reform progressive era after a transformative election, which is part of my answer to Donald Trump and what happens there. But America Ascendant, part of what led me to write the book differently was the presentation I gave here and recognizing that I'm not looking past these numbers to what's really happening in this country, which indeed continues at an accelerating rate to be younger, more urban, more diverse, more ethnic, more foreign, more immigrant as a country. And so that when I do a poll last week on the question of whether immigration is a problem for America or creates problems for America or is mostly good for America, it's 2-to-1 that immigration benefits the country, not harms it. So the context for what's happening in the country is that we're dealing with huge changes. And America is just not Britain. It's not Europe. It's not Israel. Well, that's where my friends assure me, remember, we thought Paris, was going to elect it, and we ended up with Bibi. Trump can win. And obviously, my friends who've dealt with Brexit also are saying, be careful of Donald Trump because of what happened in Britain. So the election in November will be transformative, and I know we're going to have a session on Saturday where we talk about the U.S., and I'll spend most of my time on the American politics dealing with it in that session. But I do believe it'll be a transformative election. It'll be a profound statement, an enduring statement about who America is and American values. And it will work through the details of that on Saturday. But it'll also provide some answers, I think, to the conference's themes about new communication and new politics. Because I think it will affirm, as in Brexit, that elections and protests, as in Europe and Latin America, are shaped centrally by social media, the role of Twitter, the role of Facebook. I mean, you could not have the recall campaign of Maduro without Facebook. The ability to produce millions of signatures and hundreds of thousands of people, activists on the street, without any access to national media, just tells you everything, about it. The ability of a Donald Trump to use Twitter as an alternative to paid advertising. So I think the ability in South Africa, where I worked for the Democratic Alliance, the opposition, but the ability of the EFF, which is the Black nationalist group, and the Democratic Alliance to use Twitter and Facebook to drive their campaigns without much access to media. I think makes clear is that things are very, very different. Very hard to look at the U.S. elections where TV matters not at all. Data analytics may or may not matter, and we'll come back, I think, to that question, I'm sure, in the later session. Fundraising, we still have billionaires able to buy elections or try to buy elections in the U.S. And Ukraine and elsewhere. We still have oligarchs that play big roles in elections, but it is watching Bernie Sanders and the use of the internet for fundraising to fund an implausible campaign by a socialist in a Democratic primary says a lot about how much things have changed by the new methodologies. But for me, the bigger message for political communication is that message is nearly everything, and that the rest of this matters hardly at all. Or as David Axelrod says, it's like having in American football, having a great field goal kicker or a great extra point kicker, but you have to have a team that's able to get into scoring position. We can watch a great Jeb Bush's campaign with money and access to all kinds of both paid media and social media, but it doesn't matter if you don't have a purpose, if you don't have a message. And I think that's what Donald Trump understood, that message is nearly everything. If you are successful at defining what the election is about, if you are successful in defining what the choice is, if you are successful with a message that motivates and mobilizes troops, if you are successful at defining the main problem, what is the main problem in the country and what is the right kind of change, that is where leaders succeed, not in their access. It's understanding those things that allow your social media presence to be powerful. But it has to begin with understanding what E.E. Schatzsnyder understood, and who I studied when I was an academic, who wrote about the semi-sovereign people, is that politics is really a fight between leaders who are battling over what the election's about. What's the fight about? Who gets drawn into the fight? What issues get fought about are determined by the success of leaders in defining the battle. And that's what makes this work. If you want to understand Brexit, you know, the the most consequential decision in Europe in probably many decades, in a generation, we had one side that offered control over immigration and the character of the country, and we had the other one offering material economic things, a less bad economy, but material things, versus the other side that was willing to use nationalist and racist symbols and make the case that this was the last chance to have control over the character of the country, and immigration was the central policy. It was a policy. It was numbers. You know, 300,000 net migration into Britain in the last year and announced during the election. But hundreds of thousands of net immigration over the last 5 years, the time of the Cameron government. The elites have failed on that question. And even though the Brexit were attacked by the elites for running a racist campaign, for their posters and the visuals of migrants, let's remember it was the government who had vans going into Romanian areas of London and saying, you're not welcome in Britain. And so that the question of immigration and the character of the country had become the number one issue and the main place the government was seen to have failed. Why Brexit won was because the Brexit understood what people were most upset about. Had a message. It wasn't because they had a better campaign or a better run campaign. The Guardian had an expose on the different campaigns. But at the heart of it is they defined what the choice was. And if you want to understand Donald Trump, at the same time that he was winning support in the Republican primary, he was losing the country. So don't think that his success in winning the primary has anything to do with the prospect of winning in the general election. His personal negatives went to 70% during the primary. It's down now to about 60%. But the public hated what he was saying throughout. They were never deceived. He was only winning within a Republican primary, but that's all that matters. And he understood the Republican Party, which had become, the Republican Party is a counter-revolution. The purpose of the Republican Party is to stop the new American majority, this new diverse young American majority from governing with its values. And the elites had promised, election after election, particularly starting in 2010 with the Tea Party victories in 2010, they had promised that the Republican Party would stop Barack Obama from governing with its values, and it was about Obamacare, which represented a government overreach to create dependency, particularly for minority populations. It was creating a hammock for a minority population. That's what Obamacare and Obama represented, and they motivated their base. The Republican Party is deeply angry. The Republican base of voters was deeply angry at their own leaders for failing to stop Obama, who they thought had beaten them, was governing by executive order, was allowing immigration. And immigration was the number one issue that they cared about more than the Affordable Care Act, was immigration. Because that's the piece that you could actually try to stop or slow or change right now. And immigration, and Trump understood. He ran against the leaders from day one, and he was the first one to do it. He ran against the Republican leaders. He was the person who was the most hostile to Obama. He was the one who ran from day one on immigration and the murders and rapists that was coming over from Mexico, and set the message that he's the most anti-Obama, the most anti-Republican establishment, and the one most willing to change the irreversible course that Obama has America on, and he represented that. He succeeded because he understood the Republican Party and its anger and the kind of change it wanted. It understood the moment he won. He got the nomination. Will get the nomination because of message, because he defined what the election was about. Bernie Sanders, when we look back, after this election and we look at what we learned about political communication, Bernie Sanders too was totally about message, totally about defining what the moment, what our time is. And here you have a 74-year-old socialist running against Hillary Clinton, and he said the main problem in the country is the corruption of politics and business, and the buying of politicians with big money by Wall Street, by billionaires in the top 1%, who then use government to write the rules in a way that benefit them and not the average person, not the middle class, not working people. And that was that was his one essential problem and his entryway for his entire message. When asked in debate, if there's only one policy you could do, when Hillary was asked this question, if there's only one policy that you could do as president, what would it be? Hillary listed 6, and then said, "I'll defer to Congress to see what their priorities are." Bernie Sanders said, campaign finance reform, barring corporate secret donations is my number one, and everything else follows from that. Now that may seem arcane, but it's not arcane. It was a very big, powerful statement about corruption, about the kind of change that had to take place, and understand, but for the base of support that Hillary built up amongst African American and Hispanics, Bernie Sanders won most white voters in the primaries, and the Hillary, based on the kind of the history with Obama, aligning with Obama, she ran on experience. And she ran on building on Barack Obama's successes, and that was enough to get her a majority of the votes cast, a majority of delegates, but barely in the primary, against all odds, without any of the endorsements of what were called the superdelegates, based on message. And defining the change, defining the moment, the main problem, defining the change that the country needed, he was able to bring into the electorate huge numbers of millennials in particular, but also working class voters who supported him in the primary. That came out of message, came out of his definition of what the election's about and what's the choice. And Hillary tried to run on experience, and she tried that if you want to look at why she lost the 2008 primary to Barack Obama, she ran on experience, had billboards that said "ready," big signs I remember in New Hampshire that said "ready," based on the assumption that this was a general election with a woman candidate and needed to show that she had the experience to be president. But this was a primary, where you had a change electorate, and where Barack Obama ran on change, totally on change. And the defining issue on change was the Iraq War, is what made you whether you were for change or not, and that's what Obama ran on and defeated her. His simple definition, his getting the definition of what the election's about, meant that Barack Obama won in 2008. Hillary emerged as a nominee, and she'll be the president, and I have no doubt, will get it right in terms of what the election's about. But in the primary, it was Bernie Sanders that was able to define for Democratic primary voters, what the main issues were facing the country. And that definition drew people in, set the agenda and what the issues are. So that there's no evidence that TV advertising worked in any way. You had Jeb Bush that spent probably $100 million. You had other campaigns that spent money on TV. I can't think of any evidence that traditional TV advertising and the money spent on that, what campaigns normally do, had any impact on what happened on either the Democratic side or the Republican side. And I'm skeptical that'll make any difference in the general election, which tells us a lot about how it is people are exposed to media, because people are very much engaged. Politics matters, and we're watching a surge of interest in voting in the U.S., and we saw big turnouts on the Republican side. In our polls right now, we're showing a surge of interest in voting, on the Democratic side. But what we'll look back on, I think, and see is that the campaigns that win are campaigns that define the time, and I think that we'll find that to be true, whether we're dealing with Venezuela or Latin America or Argentina, whether we're dealing, with referendum Brexit, whether we're dealing with elections in Britain, Brexit, or subsequent elections there, as well as the U.S., that the campaigns that win, even more so, even with all the change in social media, the campaigns that win are the ones that define the times, define the right kind of change, define what's at stake in the election, and these basic matter more than anything new in communication and campaigns, and should keep us focused on making politics relevant. Because in some ways, they kind of focus on analytics, data analytics, and social media, and the fascination with that misses the point that there's a lot at stake. People are engaged because there is so much uncertainty, there's so much difficulty and turmoil, there's so little lack of direction as to where countries or people or classes will find their future, and they're turning to politics. And the campaigns and leaders that know that making politics mean something are the ones that are successful, rather than the side issues of technology and analytics and new methods. Let's make politics matter. Thank you.